Welcome to the Patriotic Pulpit. We have a great show for you today, several topics that I want to cover. Number one, what's going on at West Texas A&M and freedom of speech at West Texas A&M. We also do want to talk about what's taking place on the religious front. And there are a couple of stories that really demand attention if we have time to get into all of that. And then at the very last of the show, also depending on the time, I want to talk about education. An eye on education again, and we're talking about race-based grading. So we'll talk about all of that in just a few moments. This is a story that has now come to us from West Texas A&M, and the university president has canceled a student drag show saying it degrades women. And this is from the Texas Tribune. I want to go through the article and look at a couple of the pieces of it, just lay out the facts of it so that you're aware of what's taking place in Canyon, Texas, small college in West Texas, and then look at what I believe should be a proper perspective on it. So West Texas A&M University President Walter Wendler drawing ire for canceling a student drag show, writes the Texas Tribune, arguing that such performances degrade women, and he says they are derisive, divisive, demoralizing misogyny. Now, students and many First Amendment lawyers reject those assertions, calling his comments a mischaracterization of the art form. They also argue that the cancellation violates students' constitutional rights and a state law that broadly protects free speech on college campuses, potentially setting the university up for a lawsuit. And that, of course, is the threat. Not only is this a gross and abhorrent comparison of two completely different topics, but it is also an extremely distorted and incorrect definition of drag as a culture and performance of art, students wrote in an online petition condemning Wendler's letter and urging him to reinstate the show. Students plan to protest every day this week on the campus in the small West Texas city of Canyon, according to the social media post by the open and affirming congregations of the Texas Panhandle. Drag is not dangerous or discriminatory. It's a celebration and expression of individuals, writes one student by the name of Singe Elder in a statement. Amidst the current climate of growing anti-trans and anti-drag rhetoric, we believe that it is important now more than ever to stand together and to be heard. You know, just let me stop here. Isn't that amazing? Anti-trans and anti-drag rhetoric. We have a trans individual that shot up a school in Nashville, but we're talking about anti-trans rhetoric and anti-drag rhetoric. That is, people who believe it's wrong, believe it's sinful. But you know what? We've turned everything upside down in this country. Elder, the student that we just quoted, is a part of a group of students who've organized under the name of Buffs for Drag, referring to the school's Buffalo mascot. Drag shows frequently feature men dressing as women in exaggerated styles and have been a mainstay in the LGBTQ community for decades. Drag performers say their work is an expression of queer joy and a form of constitutionally protected speech about societal gender norms. But Wendler says drag shows stereotype women in cartoon-like extremes for the amusement of others, discriminate against womanhood. That's a letter that he put out Monday, first obtained by the Amarillo news site, myhighplains.com. Wendler said the drag show was organized to raise money for the Trevor Project, a nonprofit that works to reduce suicides in the LGBTQ community. He noted that it is a noble cause, but argued that shows would be considered as an act of workplace prejudice because they make fun of women. So that's the case laid out in front of you for just a moment. But I want to take it really a step further than the president of the university. I want to take it a step further than he's laid it out to be. And I want to talk about for just a moment the concepts of morality. This is the kind of thing that occurs in society when basic concepts and foundations of morality disappear in a nation. When moral compasses are disregarded, then we had a moral compass because we're a Christian nation. When they're disregarded, then this is the kind of thing that naturally is the conclusion of it. Decency at one time was understood. Basic principles of righteousness and godliness were held. Biblical morality, ethics were a part of common law. Standards of integrity and purity were common inheritance of individuals. And things that tended to degrade or corrupt generally held that moral precepts, these things were held almost universally. So things that were generally held, these moral concepts, these were generally the understanding of our society. But when we lose our moral compass and we untether ourselves from moral principles, we are set on an ocean of wild waves that are going to break up the ship of state on the shoals of dissipation and immorality, corrupting us from the inside. Let me go back in history for just a moment. The Comstock Act of 1873 was proposed by Anthony Comstock, provided for fines and imprisonment of persons mailing or receiving obscene, lewd, or lascivious publications. Comstock was against all forms of vice, as he put it, as the United States Postal Inspector and Secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Now, lest we think these are quaint ideas of yesterday, relics of the ancient past, and many of us want to forget them, or many of people that in society want to at least, let's remind ourselves that the First Amendment, and that's what these students and First Amendment lawyers are relying on, the First Amendment was designed to enable free expression, free discussion of political and religious ideas, and to allow a free exchange of these concepts in public forums without fear of government restraint. In other words, the First Amendment was never designed to protect immorality. It was not designed to protect the ugliness that we're seeing here regarding drag shows and those kinds of things. That's not what the purpose of the First Amendment was all about. Now, the history of the First Amendment makes this emphatically clear, and anybody who needs to can look and see the history of the First Amendment and how the founders debated it and what they were really after. They did not want the suppression of religious or political ideals and concepts. That's what they did not want. Now, that's the way America understood it. That's the way it was understood universally in America until about the 1960s. In the 1960s, things became much more relaxed. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, generally, this is the direct quote, generally, the new legal environment in North America and Europe favored greater sexual permissiveness and the right to individual privacy. But the most noteworthy cultural change occurred regarding what is called the decriminalization of homosexuality. Once again, from the encyclopedia, perhaps the most significant development in this regard was the decriminalization of homosexuality in many countries and the removal of proscriptions against depictions and discussions of homosexual relationships in books, motion pictures, and other media. In other words, we have become brainwashed. We have become hardened to pornography. We become hardened to vice. We become hardened to these things in society, and we try to throw it under the First Amendment rubric. We might be reminded also of the fact that the First Amendment was never to be absolute. While Congress is forbidden, that's the federal government, from making laws that abridge the freedom of speech, it does not mean that individuals are allowed to say anything they wish to say or to display any form of lewdness that they wish. The First Amendment was established to help promote the free exchange of ideas and to promote or provide a form of redress by citizens against their own government. But not all speech and not all display is protected by the First Amendment. For example, perjury, libel, slander, not protected by the First Amendment. Neither is extortion or harassment. Furthermore, you might notice that it is criminal to yell fire in a crowded theater. Furthermore, credible threats against people are not protected by the First Amendment. Copyright rules must also be respected. But all of this demonstrates one sole fact, and that is that all speech is not protected. How about child pornography? Is that protected speech? To say so is to actually twist and torture the very concepts that our founding fathers implemented when they wrote the First Amendment. Pornography and obscenity is not to be protected by the First Amendment. But this, what's taking place in Canyon, Texas, is a perfect illustration of what occurs when we lose our moral compass in this nation, when we forget what is up and what is down, what is right and what is wrong, what is sweet and what is bitter, what is dark and what is light. And when we have no moral compass and biblical morality no longer guides individuals, then we're going to see a lot more of this kind of nonsense that's taking place with this drag show in West Texas. I know that many First Amendment lawyers are going to take me to task on that and disagree with me, but I call your attention to the fact that we have moved and shifted away from the original intent of the First Amendment and moved into an area that anything goes. And that, of course, is detrimental to society. And I applaud President Walter Windler for stopping the drag show at West Texas A&M. We'll be back in a moment. I have two stories in front of me in the religious front, which really is a cultural front, what's going on in America. And one of them is that which is taking place at the Catholic University called Villanova, where a sexual Marxist is preaching the end of white Christian America. Now, the other story relating to religion is that the Roman Catholic Pope denies the existence of eternal hell, according to an interviewer that interviewed him last week. We'll have some things to say about that, but both of these, of course, are people or institutions that are in the eye of the culture and in the eye of the storm, as is taking place right now in America and across the world. So let's think about the first one, and that is what's happening at Villanova University, the Catholic University. Miss Naomi Washington-Leapheart. She is an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ, which is an extremely liberal denomination founded in 1957 when two other churches merged. Washington-Leapheart is, as she claims herself, a black, lesbian, LGBT activist who spoke this week at Villanova University on the topic, the end of white Christian America. According to her, the white supremacist system is grounded in Christian history, texts, ideas, and institutions. She has previously worked as a faith director for the National LGBTQ Task Force for Justice and Equality. Now, the only way, she says, that I'm able to remain a Christian is to imagine that Jesus is black and queer. And that's how she put it, blasphemous as it is. So what do we say to this blasphemy? I even hate to read that kind of material. I don't even like to say that kind of material because it is so blasphemous. But what shall we say about it? Well, one observer of the homosexual movement has warned this. Gay activists are sexual Marxists. Legitimatizing same-sex unions is a warm-up act. Ultimately, they want to eliminate any barriers, any signposts that limit or channel the exercise of human sexuality. That is from Alan Sears and Greg Ostin in a book called The Homosexual Agenda, written in 2003. Now, that statement can apply back to what we talked about in the first block regarding West Texas A&M, and that is the homosexual movement in America. The legitimatizing of same-sex unions is only a warm-up act. What is now taking place in the train of that which Obama brought into America is ultimately to destroy every barrier, any signpost, limit or channel the exercise of any human sexuality. We're not going to channel it. We're not going to limit it at all. And that's why we have drag shows now in West Texas at the university, or they want to do it at least. And that's why we have this end of white Christian America preaching by Naomi Washington-Leapheart, who claims to be an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ. Now, I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, not only does she pay no attention to what the Bible teaches regarding the public assembly and women speaking in the public assembly, which they're forbidden to do as far as teaching and having authority over a man. That's 1 Timothy chapter 2, as well as 1 Corinthians chapter 14. But there are some other things that we want to notice as well. Here's from Sears and Ostin again. It actually seems that the more radical the homosexual activists, the more blatantly honest they are of their goals. They do not necessarily want marriage so that they can take advantage of its beliefs. They want marriage so they can take a wrecking ball to the institution itself. In other words, they want not only the churches to be revamped, but they want marriage itself to disappear. I want to know, now this is the statement that she made in her comments regarding homosexuality. She said the white supremacist system is grounded in Christian history and texts, ideas, and institutions. I wonder, just Miss Naomi Washington-Leapheart, which text do you have in mind as being one that furthers a white supremacist system? Where is that grounded in a Christian text? Which text of God's inspired holy word even addresses a white supremacist system? Not to mention the fact that this phrase is a leftist lie when it comes to America, but she's been brainwashed on the issue and pretends that Jesus was a black man and what we've mentioned earlier. On the other hand, inspiration clearly condemns homosexual behavior. For example, the Apostle Paul, inspired, says that neither adulterers nor effeminate, that's a homosexual playing the female role, nor abusers of themselves with men, that's a Greek term that refers to the homosexual partner that plays the male role, they shall not inherit the kingdom of God. That's 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. And those who teach otherwise are deceived or are trying to deceive others. Yes, the homosexual movement and the homosexual agenda in America is all about destroying not only the churches, not only God's holy inspired word, but also the institution of marriage itself. According to the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Organizing Manual, that's an institution, I remind you, that Washington-Leapheart served as faith director. Here's the statement that was made, or is made, in that organizing manual. An ideal policy would cover a wide range of family types. If possible, an employer should offer benefits to same-sex or same and opposite-sex couples, both romantic and non-romantic, as well as the partner's children. By crafting an inclusive policy such as this, the employer allows the employee to define his or her own family and responds to the family's needs. Moreover, an inclusive policy is more flexible and can adapt to employee family structures as they continue to change. Now, I emphasized those two lines. That's a direct quote from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Organizing Manual. The employer allows the employee to define his or her own family, and you can adapt to employee family structures as they continue to change. What is that to say, ladies and gentlemen? It's to say that there is really no institution that we call marriage. We can define marriage and family as we want to define them. And we can change it at whim and at will. That's exactly what this manual has in mind. But it's not simply marriage that they wish to destroy with a wrecking ball. It's the Bible itself, which is really forms the very moral fabric of America. You see, freedom depends upon morality, that people will manage their lives, and that is the personal lives, by the standards of Jesus Christ and natural law. But this, the homosexual movement rejects. And that's why a promotional flyer for her event broadcast it this way: a womanist path to ending white Christian America. Boiled down, it means simply this: she wishes to end not only America, its liberty, but Christianity as well. And all this cloaked in the garb of a minister. It reminds me of what we read in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20. The wicked people of his day, the Old Testament prophet, 8th century BC, they proclaimed sinful things were good. And that's why Isaiah cried, Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. A world that is in complete rebellion to God will become confused as to what is right and wrong. And that's what Washington-Leapheart, her host at Villanova, has demonstrated, as well as the clubs at West Texas A&M that want to have a drag show. They're absolutely confused as to what is good and bad and what is right and wrong. We'll be back in a moment. If you want to follow the program, you can do it on Amazon Music app, on your telephone, on your laptop. And so the show is called Patriotic Pulpit. You can find it on Amazon Music. The app also called Spotify. You can find it there. So you can follow the show on those two different apps, as well as, of course, the articles that I write on News Talk 1290. The show, of course, airs on News Talk 1290, as well as in Abilene and in Lubbock, the different radio broadcasts there. But you can find the material that I talk about in written form, some of it, that I write on the News Talk 1290 website, and you can go there to the News Talk 1290 and you can see that material. Then also, I have a website that's still active at this particular point. That's American Liberty with Bill Lockwood. You can donate there. There's a donate button if you wish to do so. All right. You can follow me that way. I wish you would. And you write into the program, whatever you'd like to say. Happy to hear from you. You know, talking about religion, which we did a few moments ago, here's one regarding the Roman Catholic Pope denying the existence of eternal hell. This is an interesting story because there's an interviewer by the name of Eugenio Scalfari who published an interview with Pope Francis last week. Now, this was in an Italian newspaper, and Scalfari is not only a journalist, but was the founder of the paper, the Italian paper. So Scalfari says that the head of the Catholic Church denies the existence of an eternal hell as a place of punishment after one dies. That's Pope Francis. Francis is quoted as saying those who die in a state of mortal sin are not subject to eternal punishment. And here's the quote that Scalfari gives. They're not punished. Those who repent obtain God's forgiveness, take their place among the ranks of those who contemplate them, but those who do not repent, cannot be forgiven, disappear. A hell does not exist. The disappearance of sinning souls exists. So hell doesn't exist. Souls simply disappear. That's the annihilation theory that some people have, which is, of course, unbiblical, unscriptural, but come back to that in a moment. Francis went on to say that hell is not a place, but simply a state of the heart, a posture towards life. Explaining himself, he went on to add that if one goes to the last judgment and sees the faces of those who go to hell, one gets scared. If you read Dante, you get scared, but these are media presentations. In other words, Jesus doesn't want anybody to be scared. Well, I'll tell you this, Francis, there's some people who are not going to change their lives unless they are rightfully scared, frightened. As a matter of fact, think about what Paul had to preach in Acts chapter 25. When he preached to Felix and he preached of righteousness, judgment to come, and we read that Felix was frightened. Well, Francis doesn't want anybody to be frightened. He describes hell as simply a state of mind. He said there are people who live in hell continuously, and you can see that on LifeSite News or on Vox. That would be the 30th of this month when that article came out. Now, the original article written and published by Eugenio Scalfari, many people point out he's an atheist, but he set off a firestorm in the news cycle, beginning with the efforts of the Vatican and other Catholic organizations to clarify what Francis actually meant. Isn't that interesting? So what is the Catholic response? I find this fascinating. The initial response is to say that the Vatican's response is simply this, that the journalist Scalfari is widely known to write his articles from memory, just relying on notes, not relying on notes that he's taken, but just relying on his memory. The Catholic News Agency reports that Scalfari has misrepresented the Pope in past interviews as well. So the Catholic News Agency says this. The agency reported that Scalfari also falsely reported that Pope Francis had made comments denying the existence of hell in 2015. Now, those 2015 remarks, however, were made with the same journalist in which Scalfari claimed that Francis denied the existence of hell and argued instead that lost souls were annihilated upon death of the earthly body. Now, this may be a popular doctrine with many people, but it is an unbiblical position. Another defense of the Pope's position is to quote what the official Catholic Church Catechism actually teaches, that there's a hell and it is eternal. Interesting, isn't it, that a Catholic news organization would come along and say, well, here's what the Catechism actually teaches. Interesting, because it's not germane to what the Pope himself believes or has stated in interviews. And still a separate line of defense is this. Well, this was not an official interview, and the words attributed to him are not a faithful transcription of the Holy Father's words. That's a direct quote. This is a frequent dodge to say, well, this was not an official interview. This is not an official declaration. This is an unofficial declaration. But there's reason to believe that Scalfari is accurate in his reporting. Now, why do I say that? Number one, how easy would it be for the Vatican to come out and say, hey, here's the Pope speaking, here's what he believes, and here's his statement, and him just come out and say, why doesn't Francis just come out and say, no, I believe that hell is an eternal place of punishment, and that people who go to hell at the end of life, punishment for sins that they have committed, they will suffer eternal punishment. Why don't they just come out and say that? Why don't they give us this accurate belief? Instead, the Roman Church is relying upon the Vatican to come out and clarify, or Catholic outlets to clarify what the Pope actually believes. We have no statement from him himself at all. I find that curious, to say the least. And here's something else interesting. There are a lot of Catholic news organizations that have defended Francis by pointing out that, well, other officials in Catholicism have denied the biblical teaching of hell as well. For example, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the most senior Catholic in England and Wales, said, there's nowhere in Catholic teaching that actually says any one person is in hell. That's from BBC News. That was the 29th of this month, just the other day. That's what they published. Well, that's not much of a retraction, is it? That's not much of a correction either. Neither is this one. This comes from Catholic Answers. I remember I had a debate several years ago with some individuals that represented, I think it was Catholic Answers, if I'm not mistaken. His name was Robert Sungenis. Anyway, this is from Tom Nash. Pope Francis has made his personal vision of hell quite clear on several occasions. During another homily in the Vatican, 2016, he said hell is not a torture chamber. Rather, it is the horror of being separated forever from the God who loves us so much. His predecessor, Pope John Paul II, said something similar in 1999. Not so much a physical place, he explained. Hell indicates the state of those who freely, definitively separate themselves from God, the source of all life and joy. End of quote. That's Tom Nash, Catholic Answers. Well, what does he say? He said, well, he's not so far off from what other people have said. Pope John Paul II said something very similar. All of that, of course, shows very well what's taking place. Francis denies the existence of hell. That is, as the Bible teaches it. What does the Bible teach? You know, several years ago, and I'm referring back to a preacher who he's a late preacher who had put out Christian Courier, and he pointed out that Bertrand Russell, that was from yesteryear, produced an essay in which he said, why I'm not a Christian. And one of the reasons that he cited that he didn't believe in Jesus Christ was because that Christ believed in hell. Now, this is from Wayne Jackson in the Christian Courier. He remarked, when I first read that observation, my inclination was this, well, at least Russell understood what Jesus believed about the matter, which is considerably more than can be said for many religionists today who profess an acquaintance with Christian doctrine. And the same thing regards the Pope also, he who calls himself the Pope, and that is Francis. That is, Bertrand Russell understood more about what the Bible taught regarding hell than apparently Francis does. Did you know that Jesus had more to say about hell than he did heaven, and more about eternal punishment than he did heaven? And this teaching is very clear. Our Lord said very pointedly that those who die unprepared will be subjected to eternal punishment, Matthew 25 and verse 46. Punishment implies awareness. Note also that punishment of the unbeliever is as enduring as eternal life that is given to the believer. The ultimate fate of the wicked will be eternal hell, Matthew 25, verse 41. The Bible describes it in Mark 9 and verse 48 as where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. The statement implies and plainly implies of an anguish that continues on. And that's exactly what is stated in Revelation 14, verses 10 and 11, where people who suffer the wrath of God are tormented forever and ever. I would be interested to hear the Pope or a Roman Catholic devotee defend non-existence of hell in explanation of these passages. How would they explain these passages? How would Francis explain these passages? All right, we'll be back in just a moment. I like to keep my eye on education. And so this segment we're dedicating once again to some educational confusion points, some education, things that are occurring in the world of education, I should say, that are very, very disturbing, to say the least. And this is what is called race-based grading. Now, several years ago, I wrote an article and have written several articles regarding what was called the JDAI program. You could look it up, Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. And it was put into place in many counties across America. The program has the stated goal, and you might say, what is JDAI? Well, it has a stated goal to reduce the detention population of juveniles, especially kids of color and ethnic minorities. It begins with the assumption that because there's a higher incarceration rate of kids of color, ethnic minorities at juvenile detention facilities, the assumption is that the system is rigged against them, and it is due to the underlying prejudices of the white population that this is the case. Now, that's how JDAI is. As a matter of fact, it was implemented in Broward County, Florida. People don't even talk about this. They simply talk about the school shooting, which, of course, we've had another school shooting in Nashville this week. A trans student shot up in Nashville, a horrific crime. Well, that was also done by Nicholas Cruz in Broward County, Florida. But what people don't tell you, they don't want you to know, I suppose, is that the JDAI program had been implemented in Broward County, Florida. Because Nicholas Cruz has a minority last name, he was let out of juvenile detention upon a number of occasions, even after he made threats against people's lives. And he ended up shooting up a Florida school. Well, JDAI, Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative Program, specifically states that it is to require states to work to reduce the disproportionate representation of minority juveniles in secured facilities. That's a direct quote. To reduce the disproportionate representation of minority juveniles in secured facilities. Now, the underlying reasons for this misbehavior, such as broken homes or cultural value systems that are completely different, they're not even considered when accounting for misbehavior. That is what social justice is all about. It has nothing to do with real justice. This was furthered so much by Barack Obama, and now is, of course, put on steroids by the current president of the United States, Joe Biden. Nothing to do with justice, but focuses upon disparities in society and arms the government in order to equalize the outcomes. So we're going to have outcomes in the detention facilities, and now we're going to have outcomes, equalize the outcomes in grading practices in schools. Now, this is what's going on in public education. How is this accomplished? Well, in the JDAI program, it was accomplished by refusing to lock up minorities. That is, we're going to have to equalize the number of whites versus Hispanics and blacks in juvenile detention facilities. Well, how's it going to work with grading system? Well, that's what we're going to talk about here. This equity template is being used in school grading systems. Local Government Information Services, which is LGIS, published a piece in an Illinois paper called West Cook News. And it's not simply in Illinois. You'll find it in Virginia, and some of the same ideas are floated also in the state of Texas. As far as I'm aware, they're not being practiced in the state of Texas or Oklahoma, but you know very well they're coming down the pike. So in West Cook News, that's an Illinois paper published by LGIS, it entitled, OPRF is to implement race-based grading system in the 2022-2023 school year. Now, the OPRF stands for Oak Park and River Forest High School System in the suburbs of Chicago. What are they going to do there? They're going to require teachers to adjust their classroom grading scales to account for the skin color or ethnicity of its students. That, again, is a direct quote from the West Cook News. Teachers to adjust classroom grading scales to account for skin color or ethnicity of the students. You wonder why public education is failing students. You wonder why the students that come out of the public education system have lower and lower abilities as far as academic achievement is concerned. Well, we're talking about why it's the case. This is exactly what people are all about. Student grades at OPRF have been poor, to say the least. The school system, with many blacks, African Americans, many Hispanics, and so LGIS says this: in an effort to equalize test scores among racial groups, OPRF will order its teachers to exclude from the grading assessment variables that it says disproportionately hurt grades of black students. They can no longer be docked for missing class, misbehaving in school, failing to turn in their assignments according to the plan. That is race-based grading. Continuing, these are quotes, direct quotes from West Cook News. Advocates for so-called equity-based grading practices, which seek to raise the grade point averages of black students and lower scores of higher achieving Asian, white, and Hispanic ones, say new grading criteria are necessary to further school district's mission of DEIJ, that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. All right, that's the end of the quote. Now, as you might imagine, there are many people, many websites, and official websites and people who bloggers are saying this is false information. Lockwood is all about false information. So a number of organizations have hurried to label that story about OPRF and race-based grading as false. For example, Snopes, the Chicago Tribune, Business Insider, AP News, Chicago Business, and others, just to name a few, have thrown the penalty flag on LGIS that initially reported West Cook News, or through West Cook News. That was the Illinois paper, and LGIS is the publishing system. And said, all that's false. However, you should be by now, those who are at least in the clue about what's going on in America, you should be, of course, skeptical about it, just as Facebook has fact checkers and official censors that always are throwing flags on conservative news sites and conservative news pieces, and they're always wrong. You'll find that's always the case. You'll find the case is censorship is a subjective and inaccurate practice. And this is, of course, real danger when gigantic organizations and government entities are involved in censorship. Because the school board members at OPRF discussed this exact plan in May 26 meeting, in which Laurie Fiorenza, an administrator in that district, provided a slide presentation titled Transformative Education. I've looked at it. I've watched it. She spoke to the schools in Cook County, that's Chicago, Illinois, and it included the following. And here's what she said. We're going to examine equitable grading practices that are to be implemented in the fall of 2023. Teachers are then to, quote, integrate equitable assessment and grading practices into all academic and elective courses. This is to include restorative practices. You see, people who pay attention to what's happening and you hear the word restorative, such as restorative justice, you immediately have your antenna up. You know exactly what's coming along the line here. So, says Fiorenza, these will include restorative practices and will center on equity. There's one of the key words as well, equity. Teachers will utilize the racial equity analysis tool. Well, what is that? What is the racial equity? I'm going to combine it all here. What is the racial equity analysis tool? Well, it is to consider policies of grading that considers race. How so? Okay, here's how Fiorenza presented it in her presentation. That educators should read Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. That's a recommended paper. Joe Feldman, look him up. Feldman, Feldman. Feldman is a part of a crescendo education group out of Oakland, California. This is what Fiorenza in Chicago wanted to take place. You go look it up. Teachers and administrators in that school district, look up Feldman. Feldman's paper plainly emphasizes over and over again that teachers do not know how to grade because of implicit bias against minorities. Traditional grading has within it, he says, embedded inequities and inaccuracies. I'm going to say this, not an overstatement, that this assertion is the foundation of Feldman's entire thesis. Quoting from Feldman, traditional grading practices are often corrupted by implicit racial, class, and gender biases. That's one subheadline that he has. These implicit biases, he claims, have resulted in disproportionately punishing African Americans, Latinos, low-income, and special education students, and these biases similarly impact aspects of individual teachers' grading. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I would think, wow, I cannot believe that he would write a line that say African American, Latino, low-income, and special education, going to group them all together. Special education students with minorities, African Americans, and Latinos. That's what he's done here. It's further asserted by Feldman, that is recommended by Fiorenza, to be implemented in Chicago in the fall of this year. It is asserted by Feldman that what they call soft skills, behaviors, attendance, participation, and effort should be discarded as figuring into a student's grade. In plain English, what does that mean? Minority students are a huge behavior problem at OPRF. Academic achievement lags far behind other students. But rather than holding blacks and Hispanics accountable for their behavior or requiring them to meet academic standards that are required of other students, OPRF will follow Feldman's recommendation to quit assessing poor behavior or factoring it into grades, including attendance in class. So what are they going to do? This is a fad. They're going to say, well, so you might have a straight A student. You might have a low-functioning, low academic achievement minority student. But they're going to say, well, he's improved. He's shown improvement from a D grade to or an F grade to a C grade, and he's going to be graded on the same level as a high-functioning straight A student because, after all, he's showing improvement. Well, there's not that improvement in the straight A student. Now, that's what's taking place, and we're not going to take into consideration behavior in class, attendance to class, or any kind of misbehavior that's taking place in the school at all. We're not going to even consider that. Now, that's what's happening. It's so sad to see that adults who should be running the system are capitulating to simply this chaos on the bottom and now implementing race-based grading. The fact is, there is a disparity in grades. They're assuming that it's caused by prejudice, and the solution is change the entire system.